Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of the Pakistan Pivot. Today on the podcast, I'm very honored to be hosting Dr. Hussain Nadim. Dr. Nadim is the Executive Director at Islamabad Policy Research Institute. He's done his bachelor's from George Washington University, his master's from Cambridge University, and his PhD from University of Sydney, all in politics and international relations. Because of the unique insights that he has to offer, we're going to be understanding the Russia-Ukraine conflict with him today. We're really going to be breaking it down and understanding what it means from a global perspective, local perspective, and policy perspective. Thank you for your time and thank you for being here.
My pleasure to be here, Mariam.
हम conversation शुरू करते हैं. I think just with essentially you trying to tell us what is the conflict, what is happening, who are the stakeholders, and क्या हो क्या रहा है इस वक्त in Russia-Ukraine.
Sure, thank you very much. There are too many ways to look at this conflict. एक है European angle अगर आप देख लें, एक है आपका Russian angle, then you have the American angle, and then there is the rest of the world, which is 80 to 90% of the world that have a very different understanding of it. So first thing जो कि I want to bring it as a disclaimer is that there is no one way to look at this conflict, and this conflict is not new. ये नया नहीं है, ये चलता हुआ आ रहा है. अक्सर औक़ात ये होता है कि कोई एक वॉर स्टार्ट हुई है तो हमें इन्फॉर्मेशन मिलना शुरू होती है एंड देन वी स्टार्ट गेटिंग अंडरस्टैंडिंग कि शायद ये अभी रिसेंटली डेवलप्ड सिचुएशन है. अनफॉर्चुनेटली जो यूक्रेनियन क्राइसिस अभी चल रहे हैं, दे हैव अ लॉन्ग रूटेड हिस्ट्री स्टार्टिंग फ्रॉम 1991 व्हेन सोवियत यूनियन से यूक्रेन अलहदा हुआ, कोलैप्स ऑफ सोवियत यूनियन, रशिया बना, सैटेलाइट स्टेट्स जो थी वो आपकी इंडिपेंडेंट हुई, यूक्रेन वाज वन ऑफ देम, एंड सिंस देन टिल नाउ देयर हैज़ दिस यूक्रेन सिट्स एट अ वेरी interesting place which is kind of similar to Pakistan in a way that it's still under the sphere of Russian influence, but at the same time it's the largest European country, so it's in between two very big giants. And जब आप ऐसी जगह पे फंस जाएं तो फिर it is very hard for you to remain, the word I'm going to use is neutrality and balance. And what we see right now is essentially last 2 decades or 3 decades of constant back and forth, and the covert wars and the influences of the Western countries and the Russians, which has eventually led to this situation to boil over. हो क्या रहा है वहाँ पे? Let's look at from this angle. What does Russia want? A lot of time, if you look at the Western media, the simple answer is that Putin is a monster, he's just blood hungry and he wants to control Ukraine and all of that. But it's a little bit more nuanced. पिछले कुछ सालों से 2004 से और ख़ास तौर पर 2011-12 से आपकी एक सिस्टमैटिकली यूक्रेन के अंदर वेस्टर्न एक्सपेंशन, वेस्टर्न इन्फ्लुएंस आ रहा था, विच इंक्लूडेड मिलिटराइजेशन ऑफ यूक्रेन, विच इंक्लूडेड डेवलपिंग कोवर्ट बेसिस एंड नाउ वी सी इज बायो लैब्स इन यूक्रेन टेरिटरी, विच वॉज एसेंशली अगेंस्ट टारगेटेड टुवर्ड्स रशिया. सो नेटो की जो एक्सपेंशन थी यूक्रेन के अंदर, दैट वॉज बीइंग चेक्ड, दैट वॉज बीइंग curtailed बाय द रशियंस टिल टू अ पॉइंट वे रशियंस ड्रू अ लाइन, जो कि फरवरी के अंदर उन्होंने 2022 में ड्राइन ड्रू की कि इस लाइन से आगे अगर वेस्टर्न एक्सपेंशन, नेटो एक्सपेंशन जाती है तो देन वी विल बी फोर्स्ड टू टेक डिफेंसिव मेजर्स. सो ये आपका रशियन बेसिकली एंगल है. व्हाट डू दे वांट? दे वांट 3 थिंग्स एसेंशली. 1, दे वांट कि मिलिटराइजेशन ऑफ यूक्रेन should be curtailed. 2, they want independent neutrality of Ukraine as well. They don't want Ukraine to be in the campaign in the camp of NATO, जो कि एक constant campaign चल रही थी to put it in the membership of NATO. And third thing they want is that the Ukraine recognizes Crimea and Donbas region, जो कि Russian पॉपुलेशन है वहाँ पे और जिसकी वजह से रशिया हैज़ ओल्डर क्लेम टू इट. सो ये आपका रशिया का इंटरेस्ट है. यूक्रेन का इसके अंदर इंटरेस्ट बड़ा सिंपल है, दैट वी नीड एज अ सॉवरेन कंट्री टू मेक आवर ओन डिसीजंस, टू बी इंडिपेंडेंट एंड टू टेक साइड्स ऑफ wherever you want, and to essentially be living in a place of stability and peace without the pressure from either of the two sides. And then there is a European and the American angle, which essentially is continuing to thrive in a Cold War era mindset, which sees Russia as a threat, as an empire, and it wants to invest itself in areas where it can put Russia towards check. So ये आपकी 3-4 इसके अंदर different angles हैं. फड्डा भी इसी पे चल रहा है.
When you say US and Europe is in the Cold War mindset, do you not think Russia is also in that Cold War mindset?
So if you take a zoom out a little bit, you realize that the world where we live in, and I think it's very hard for us to understand when we're day to day doing analysis, it's still a post-colonial world. We do think that somehow आपकी colonies जो former थी वो ख़त्म हो गई और अब हम आज़ाद हो गए हैं. आज़ाद इतने नहीं हुए हम जो आपकी इंटरनेशनल पॉलिटिकल कन्फिग्रेशन है, अगर आप उठा के देखें, इनमें वही आपकी फॉर्मर कॉलोनीज़ हैं, इंपीरियल एम्पायर्स हैं, जो कि अभी भी आपकी प्लेस है. फॉर इंस्टेंस, इफ यू टेक द करंट क्राइसिस इन यूक्रेन, द एक्टर्स आर एग्जैक्टली द सेम एक्टर्स दैट वर इन्वॉल्वड इन World War II and in the World War I as well. I mean, you have US, you have UK, you have France, you have Germany, you have Russia. These were the key actors in all the major world wars and throughout the Cold War as well. So थोड़ा zoom out करके देखें तो you realize that this is the past is a prologue. It's a continuation of the same old colonial configuration, fights, power politics and all of that. So from the Pakistan's angle and our angle, which became very problematic recently, we don't take sides because we don't differentiate between two devils that are fighting with each other. So is वजह से I think colonial configuration is still very much present, and which also continues the new style of Cold War. So yes, Russia is also part of the same Cold War mindset because it continues to see West as an expansionist power that is out there to destabilize Russia.
By new style of Cold War, what do you mean? And then do you think Russia is able to achieve its objectives that you've pointed
By
out?
the new style of Cold War, I mean there are new tactics, there are new methods, there is new technology, and there are new actors as well. And the new actors, Russia is not the key actor in the new style of Cold War. It is between the US and China. So Russia is a sub-actor within that group, where the US is trying very hard to club Russia and China together as an ally, which is out there against the West. So I do think the Western countries, specifically the US, thrives much better when there are clear demarcations, us versus them, West versus East. Otherwise, in situations where the waters are muddled and there is that inner, where that requires nuance in the battles, like what we saw in Afghanistan, the countries like the US, they don't do very well in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, where you don't know you can't differentiate between the friend and the foe. So it's very good for the US to fight big battles where the us and against them are very much visible.
Very interesting. इसमें then if US is trying to create ये us or them का idea, उसमें we do see कि then बात होती है कि पाकिस्तान की जो neutrality है वो इस वजह से आ रही है because it's influenced by China, or because of its interests with Russia, and because again East and then West, जिसमें the foreign policy में भी this conversation happens कि okay, is this why we're behaving this way? And then from US perspective, do you think it's able to maintain this us versus them? Yeah, do you think वहाँ पे भी एक divide है where now we're seeing the West kind of falling as a group?
I think one of the most interesting aspects of this entire crisis is that it has brought to surface some of the very deeply embedded, I hate to call it, but racism in many ways, deeply embedded Western centricism, the hypocrisy, how the war is covered, how the policy and the think tanks, they talk about war and what they expect out of the other countries. I'll give you one example. The way the Western powers, including European powers, have been pressurizing Pakistan and India recently to take a side. It's very much a reflection of how the colonial powers continue to configure these worlds. I mean, if you look at how in the World War II, our forefathers, including my grandfather, these people left their lands to fight a war in Europe for the British Empire, just to get the freedom. The freedom to do what? The freedom to essentially say no to them. So when there is a war like this happens again. And I think for Pakistan, there is this again through a very imperial mindset. The Western powers continue to think that countries like Pakistan cannot make rational decisions, decisions that are not that they think are not good for us, because they continue to believe these things that somehow the intellectual and the policy class over here is subordinate or subservient to the intellectual prowess of the West, which basically means that जब पिछले दिनों आपके Russian Pakistani Prime Minister Russia गए, the criticism was that it is bad for optics, it is not good for Pakistan, it is a stupid move, it is silly and all, not recognizing that Pakistan and its policy makers understand very well what the national interests are. And you see, at that period, in those 48 hours, for Pakistan to say, I mean, the Western powers, which are continuing to do their own businesses with Russia, despite of the sanctions, despite of everything, somehow expecting Pakistan कि आप Russia ना जाएं, जो कि एक ट्रिप पहले से अरेंज हुआ था, means basically one thing कि 48 hours में European countries ने तो भूल जाना था, but Russia would have never forgotten. the cancellation of the trip. So for Pakistan and countries like Pakistan, it is very important that we have a very good situational awareness of what the war is. And I mean, if anybody thinks that this war is driven by some humanitarian ideas or the liberal world order or any of the concerns on human rights, it's not the case. Because if that was the case, then you would Kashmir, then you would see other places. But then again, our lives are not that important maybe. But I don't want to go into the emotive side of things. But the very fact is that from a rational perspective and a more of a realist perspective, Pakistan did the one right thing in its foreign policy history, which is to basically tell to the European countries that this is not about you. And we will not continue to be emboldened into your characterization of the world as good and evil, as right or wrong, because we see this war from a very different angle. We have sympathies for the lives that are being lost in Ukraine. We have sympathies for the humanitarian crisis. There are over 3 million refugees right now. I mean, we're the ones that can recognize them most because we've been hosting 4 to 5 million Afghan refugees over here for the past many years. So we do sympathize. But at the same time, if the West continues to feel that somehow we should be part of this war and condemn country A, country B, country C, I don't think we will be part of that because of some simple reason. We can't put the short-term political interests of the Western powers over our long-term national and development interests. We don't want to be part of another war.
Or national and development interests से you mean, say for example, economic ties with Russia. So जिस तरह जब बात हुई तो gas pipeline की जो बात हुई, so you think this is a one way, economics is one. What is the national?
See, if this is one of the things that the Western powers continue to ask us in private, that you don't even have that much of a trade with Russia, and all your trade is essentially with the European countries with the GSP plus status and the Americans. So why would you not support us? And I think this is where I would like to bring that again, that the decolonization, the post-colonial angle, that not everything is about numbers. Not everything is about right now, zero-sum game, us, them. The way Pakistan feels is that there are principles involved over here as well. We have had invested over the last decade with growing ties with Russia, partly because we realized that for the very long time, Pakistan was in a Western camp, which didn't really help us. We fought 2 long wars for the Western powers, one in the 80s and one in the 2000s, with the net result was that we were thrown under the Pressler amendments after the first one. And now we're told by the Americans straight up, point blank, that we should get over them and that they have much better partnership with India. They're free to do what they want. But we fought a 20 years war, and at the end of that war, we are told that, look, you handle the Afghan refugees, we're not going to give you any money, and the money that is even there for the Afghan government, we're going to seize that money to give to our people. So having that level of experience with the Western powers, sure, they can do what they want, but our level of faith and trust in them is not so much there, which is why it forces us to diversify our avenues of friendship. And that's something that we've been doing for the last 6-7 years with Russia. And at this point, when that was at its fruition, the Western powers somehow forcing and asking us to join their camp without an incentive, without any reasonable, plausible reason, I think that was that just carried colonial tropes. And I think we will not be pressurized into doing that.
Right. Just to be more clear, एक कैंप है वेस्टर्न कैंप जिसकी हम बात नहीं मान रहे, but are we getting out of that camp and are we going to a Russian camp, or are we not doing camps and we are staying neutral? Because जब Russia visit हुआ, उसके बाद जो statement आई, उसमें it was said that we condemn war and we have always talked about diplomacy, and that diplomacy is the way forward, negotiations is the way forward. So it was a very clear statement about condemning war. And that it affects the people, and in that case it will affect Ukraine. ठीक है. उसके बाद जब UN में resolution pass हुई, Pakistan abstained from voting on it. उसमें of course it said कि the resolution itself में कुछ था, ये था. Now just last night we heard that Pakistan sent assistance to Ukrainian people in terms of food, humanitarian aid essentially. So are we taking a stand, or are we being neutral? And as being neutral, what does this mean? Because neutrality kya hoti hai in politics? I mean, it really doesn't make sense to me.
That's a very good question. I think at the very outset, I should have probably talked about this thing. When Pakistan talks about neutrality, there is one fundamental principle that goes missing in that for the people's understanding. Pakistan does not subscribe to camp politics. Okay. We just don't agree to this us, them, this whole binary of the people. We don't agree with that. And this is coming from a very hardcore post-colonial angle, that to create monsters out of people that you don't understand. Anybody who's over the age of 16 is wearing a shalwar kameez and is sporting a beard is not a terrorist. And this is exactly what these definitions were back when the US was fighting the Afghan war. For the portfolio, the profile they developed for the reliable targets of the drone strikes.
The war on terror,
On the war on terror, it was any Pashtun kid over the age of 16 with a beard is a potential terrorist. And now anybody who's not supporting the American or the Western sanctions against Russia is somehow the other camp. Or anybody who's part of the BRI is a Chinese camp. I'm sorry, but the whole idea of Pakistan, in which I think the Pakistani people also need to recognize very closely, is that not that Pakistan wants to remain just neutral. It is the neutrality comes from our very core principle that we don't believe in camp politics. We believe that people are one, the world is one. We're facing current crisis. If you look at Prime Minister Imran Khan, he's been talking for the last 3 years of the growing climate crisis. He's talking about Islamophobia. He's talking about things that are actually existential crisis for the world. So what is Pakistan's message? And what again, for the most of the underdeveloped countries, that is the main core of idea that we don't want to be part of bloc politics, the camp A, camp B, because it is the countries like ours that get most hit when there are two big powers that fight. So we don't have that same level of economy or same level of development. And our people, when the war hits, our people are the ones that are first to hit. So for us, if you want to use a particular angle, you have to get over the fact that there is camp politics. Our vision is that there is no camp politics and we will not be part of that camp politics. If you take that a lens, then you put it on the neutrality part, you'll realize that our neutrality is not that, oh, we're just going to remain silent in the face of a war or face of brutality. We will talk about the brutality which we have. We will talk about the injustice which we have. But if you expect us to join a particular camp, and the UN voting and all of that was essentially a camp politics. And our absentia from that was not because we agreed with Russia or we disagreed with the European countries. Our absentia was because of the very fact that the world is being polarized into camp politics. A world that is already polarized is being further polarized. At this moment, you need to talk, you need to have diplomatic solutions, and the Prime Minister and most of our political leadership has been constantly talking about the fact that there is no military solution to this. So that message is for Russia. And the other message that you need to find a diplomatic solution is for the Western powers as well. So we must get over the camp politics. And that, unfortunately, is the Hobbesian worldview that actually the 16th century Hobbesian worldview that the Western powers still continue to put in their policy dynamics, that somehow there is a zero-sum game. And that I think we don't agree with.
And based on abhi ye stance, do you think Pakistan will be able to maintain this given your assessment of कि abhi ye situation किस तरह escalate करेगी? Will the war end? Will it further increase? Based on अभी हमने पहले बात की रशिया के क्या ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हैं, वो कितने मीट हो रहे हैं, कितने नहीं हो रहे. There are some things जिस पे बस दोनों हार्ड स्टक हैं. So you're just not able to move beyond that. So given that this continues this way, given that आपने ये भी कहा कि दोनों पोस्ट कॉलोनियल माइंडसेट में खेल रहे हैं, then do countries like Pakistan find themselves be able to take this stance of neutrality? How do you assess
what's going to
that?
happen with the Ukraine-Russia crisis is very hard to say, to pinpoint a ball, but I do personally think that this should, the fifth round of conversations, the dialogue between Russia and Ukraine happened yesterday on Tuesday. There wasn't any major breakthrough, but what is obvious now is that Russia wants to wrap up its military operations. That's there. Part of the reason is because Russia cannot sustain for too long in this the whole sanction era and the whole information warfare that is there and the whole presence on ground. For Ukraine as well, it would like to get over with this ASAP by the end of March, because there are over 5 million refugees perspective that are going to be out by the end of March. For European powers, again, they cannot take that much influx of refugees from coming from these countries. So apart from the US, rest everybody would probably want the war to end by the end of March. Now, what does the Russia want and what has it achieved? I've already mentioned what Russia wants. The negotiation really is on the fact that Russia wants the Ukrainians to recognize Crimea as part of Russia and also Donbas region. as the newly independent part of Russia. And I think that is where the deadlock right now is, because the Ukrainian government does not and is not willing to do that at the moment, which is why there is a constant pressurization, there is constant bombardment in Kyiv right now, for the Ukraine to essentially bend down on its knees and give away that. For the Ukraine, they're ready to essentially accept a lot of demands, but they want but they want essentially the troops to withdraw, and they want its security, and it's essentially wanted security guarantees both from Russia and from the Western powers, which is not there yet. But I do foresee that right now the ground is very much under the influence of negotiations, and I do think that there are good chances that by the end of the March we'll see a sort of running document of the negotiations and a possible solution to this.
Right. You use the word Western powers a lot, but then we've also seen, conversation happen कि ये जो West की एक understanding थी of this one solidified group, और उसमें EU है, उसमें NATO है, and then they work together for their sovereignty, for all the states' sovereignty. एक पे attack होगा तो there was this conversation कि maybe that is not so true, because European countries continue to safeguard their interests if it means trade with Russia otherwise. So, and then there was also talk about NATO itself, कि NATO की क्या ज़रूरत है, NATO का क्या काम है इस 21st century में. How do you understand all of this, US के साथ इन सब के ties, and really what's happening in the West? अगर हम थोड़ी सी इस पे बात करें.
We use West as a collective term, but it's a wrong term to use. For the purpose of interviews and all, we use that. West is diverse. West has opinions, diverse opinions. There is European powers and there is an American power. Americans have very different interests of wars compared to the European, because Americans are not directly affected by the Ukrainian crisis. For it meets the larger goals of essentially weakening Russia and using that as a leverage against China. So for the Americans, that's there. The Europeans have to live in the country, and a lot of Ukrainian refugees is probably not the best thing for the European power. So it wants a quick end to this, but an end that does not mean that Russia becomes a bigger power and Russia becomes a hegemon in the region, and the European powers essentially become reliant on Russia. What you see right now is that it's, again, if you look at the World War I, if you look at the World War II, exact same intersections, exact same interdependencies are still very much there. While the European countries are putting on sanctions, they're still paying $1.5 billion a day to the Russian for the oil and gas. So those things are very much present, and I do think that in this European affair of different countries, post-colonial, former colonies, the battles are still very much the same. The empires are not there. The imperial powers might not be there. The countries are fighting the still same wars over geography, over resources, over trade deals. And I think that is at the crux of this entire thing, which again is one of the reasons why Pakistan does not want to get involved. Because there is not an economic interest. There is no incentive. This is nothing to do with us. It's an old colonial era war that has continued to go on. And countries like Pakistan and India being forced into this is just bizarre, in my opinion.
आपने बात की about how the tools that are used, or maybe like the form of war, is similar, like in terms of geography पे बात है, but then there are other things that we see. Perhaps तब भी होता था, but now we see it more in terms of information warfare. I want you to talk about that. You did briefly mention it earlier in terms of the different narratives that are being thrown out of the West and then from Russia as well. There's a lot of talk happening about कि इस era में disinformation, misinformation, propaganda warfare, use of information technology, cyber का क्या, what is its role in winning wars or losing wars? I want you to kind of take your time to. Sure. You're an expert on policy data. You work on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we look very closely. We actually published a study just yesterday on the whole dynamics of information warfare happening on Ukraine. There are two battles going on right now. One is the military side of it, the ground battle, military operations. The other one is the fifth generation, which includes the information warfare, the economic warfare, the psychological warfare that's already there. The West is winning very much on the information warfare on Twitter. Russia is winning very much on the ground battle. It's taken over much of Ukraine. Major cities, Mariupol is down, from what I understand. Kyiv is being constantly bombarded. Two regions are already in the hands of Russians. So on the military side, the Russians have a dominance. But what is lacking on the Russian side is the information side of things. And I can understand why, because Russia is supposedly the best when it comes to disinformation warfare. And yet, if you look at very closely, Russia's information warfare campaign is completely missing. And I can understand why, is because the information warfare is good when the military objectives are limited.
Okay.
When the military objectives are more important, then you can wait on the information warfare and let the battlefield speak itself. So by the time the war will be over, that information will essentially define history. So the Russia's lack of interest and investment in the information warfare is partly because it recognizes that we need to focus on the military side of things. And in the lack of it, it is allowing basically the Western media houses, I mean, I'm trying to figure it out because I work on the Stratcom part, and it doesn't make sense that there is lack of information warfare. But then I understand that the Russians have allowed the West an open space to run whatever narrative. And the narrative that is being run are essentially painting Russia as an aggressor, as somebody that is conducting this A, B, C, D, the atrocities. In a military warfare domain, that really works very well, because the West is now doing unconsciously your propaganda that is breaking the will of the Ukrainians, that look, the Russians are so aggressive, the Russians are this and that. Back in the days of the Mongols, there was this, when they were out and about to Central Asia, taking over the empires, the Ottomans and others, there was this propaganda induced by the Mongols, which was that Mongols, after winning, they kill their enemies and they drink their blood. And just the very fact that this propaganda was permeating through the Central Asian empires, nobody was willing to fight the Mongols. But the horrifying images of Mongols drinking blood was more than enough to kill your will to fight. And I think West has not probably recognized that it has aided the Russians in that propaganda, that the Russians are aggressive, they are doing atrocities and all of that. And I think somewhere in the middle, the Western powers realized, the media realized that maybe we're aiding them. And hence, there was a little bit backstop on that. So the information domain is very important. But again, when the military operations are in present, I do think the information takes a little bit backseat. How the Westerns are fighting at the moment is, if you look at it, they're not providing any serious arms supplies. They're not providing any serious assistance to the Ukrainians. But what they're providing is a motivation and the willingness that we stand with you. But those are empty words. On the information side, yes, the Ukrainian president is coming out as a hero. And the West loves to create heroes and monsters. But that's not what the Ukrainian people probably want. They want their sovereignty, they want their security, they want their livelihood. Just having one hero out of the war means nothing when the entire war and the entire post-war scenario is going to be in favor of Russia. So I think these are very two different dynamics, where sometimes nation states continue to invest too much in hybrid warfare and in the information warfare, not recognizing that at the end of the day, between reality and perception, the reality will always win. And will take over the perception.
But a lot of times perception is, helps create this reality, which is what you're also talking about. And then, I mean, even in Russia, हम देख तो रहे हैं कि crackdown हो रहा है. There is censorship, certain state channels and are being used a certain way. And Russia में ये होता भी रहा है. So perhaps they don't necessarily, it's kind of instilled in their state machinery, and they are able to do that. So at this point, I mean, I understand कि एक on ground ज़्यादा है तो उनको ज़रूरत नहीं है इतनी information करने की जितनी West को है. But then how do you really understand what is happening if there's this narrative continuously that is being told from the West, which is painting Russia, like you said, and then you have how you started the conversation with saying it's more than that, it's more nuanced, and Russia case mein ye objectives, and then how does one, from a policy perspective, really
you see, the way the information warfare you see on Russia right now against Russia, one, it has a long history. It's nothing new. How long? Over 100 years back. Started from the Tsar Nicholas, when there was a propaganda against Tsar Nicholas being weak and not being able to hold his monarchy and all of that. That propaganda has continued till Stalin, the Bolsheviks. I'm not sure how much you remember, but during the Bolshevik Revolution, the entire Europe got together in terms of denouncing it, because they felt that something like this might happen over here, the Red Revolution and all. And from that Red Revolution, it has continued till the very end of the Soviet Empire. For 100 years, that campaign went. And what you see right now is not a new propaganda. Russia has always been, I mean, back in the days, Germany was also that one problematic child of Europe. But Russia was the biggest problematic child of Europe for the very, very long time in the English-speaking world. So that is what you see right now, is a series of that Russian propaganda against Russia, the red communists, godless atheists, that entire propaganda was there. What you need to only do now is just trigger, and that memory downloads itself into the Western media, into the Western civilization, showing Russia and its action as somehow aggressive. But if you look at from the Russian angle, and I'm not justifying or I'm not advocating for Russia, but if you look at from their angle, it's completely defensive. That for the last 15-20 years, the Western powers have been continuing to militarize the regions, the Donbass and other regions against Russia at a time when Russia does not even pose a threat. So who's to be blamed over here? I think it's the lens. It's what lens you use. But the information warfare, again, is not new in this. It's been going on. How much of it is going to be beneficial for the Ukrainian people or on ground? That is where my concern is. For the US, they sure, information warfare will help Russia paint as a particular monstrous empire. It was already considered that. Not like it wasn't considered, it was ever considered in a good overtone. So what are we getting really out of it, except for, let me really explain. In a kinetic stage of warfare, military operations are more important. Information warfare allows you to undertake on-ground reality changes. If the information warfare is limited to information warfare without any political or military ends, it's meaningless. So what we see right now from the Western powers, the information warfare is really, I mean, we're banning McDonald's, we're banning Coke and all of that. Everyone knows that these are irrelevant, these are minuscule level of sanctions that are going to mean nothing, and in a month's time they'll all be back there. And Russia, most importantly, understands that these sanctions are meaningless and they can't change the behavior unless you start changing the equation on the oil and gas, which you're not ready to do because you rely entirely on the Russian gas. So
right, you think sanctions abhi jo impose ho rahe hain, they're really not a big threat to
Russia had in their war game, they had already incorporated the sanctions. To what extent, probably they didn't realize, but these tiny little sanctions that are going around, while, I mean, it's like tiptoeing around the sanctions. They're throwing sanctions, they're putting oligarchs in checks and all. But remember one thing, that all of these people that are there, the European elite, they're all hand in tied with each other. So,
but Germany has cancelled the Nord Stream pipeline. Switzerland has frozen assets that it has of Russia. So
temporary basis. So, I mean, the Russians can sustain that. I mean, if it's on the temporary basis, which it will be, the damages will be there and all of that. But I do think that the Russians can fight on with this thing, but not for too long, which again is not in their favor because they do want to get away with this, and Europeans don't want to fight for too long as well.
Right. Thoda sa, I realize we haven't talked about China and India. We talked about this region. Pakistan ki humne baat ki. I want you to explain what, like Pakistan ke alawa, then now how is this region viewing this? Because ripple effects of war aate hain developed, underdeveloped या developing countries पे और ज़्यादा आते हैं in the camp politics ways that you talked about. इस वक्त, what does this mean? First, perhaps we can talk about India as well, and then I'd also like to talk about China.
I think one very interesting thing that has emerged out of this, of the many things that are there, is the not the resurgence, but is the fact that the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that has come out on the surface and become more visible. If you look at the countries that have not voted in favor of the sanctions and the UN, it's Pakistan, it's India, China, Russia naturally, and Bangladesh. So these SCO countries that are there, I think SCO has come out as a major bloc, which has become visible under these crises. The regional connectivity is becoming more and more important. Partly what I say is that because any country that is looking right now to how the West has responded to the warfare is essentially with sanctions, Apple banning its products, Visa, MasterCard, the entire banking system and all. So any country that is somewhere in the in the gray zone of the United States, like Saudi Arab, like Iran, like other places, they would, and like China, they would be very much concerned right now that this, I mean, the Western world can literally rip apart your economic stability. It can take away your assets. I mean, it's unfair. As much as you would like to argue, it's really unfair that there is no really international order. There is no international principle that guides the international politics. So if this can happen, what is happening right now is, check out the news for the past few days. Russia wants to have Russia wants to support, China wants to support Russia in its currency exchanges. So does the Saudis as well. So Saudi wants to sell the oil to China in yuan. India is already talking about having a rupee-ruble trade basis, because now Russia is on sanctions and you can't do the trade in dollars. So they want to do it in rupee and ruble. That's already happening in 5-6 days within the war that started. Which basically means is that the countries on the periphery and the rest of the world is very, very clearly recognizing that we're living in an unfair world where our stability is fragile, and we need to find a diversified model of not to rely completely on the West. Hence, you see the Saudi and the India. So the SCO has become very important.
Sorry to cut you, but then India and US ka isme kis tarah relation?
So India and the US, so I personally believe that India is one of the most miserable places at the moment, because for the last 74 years, India had a very, very much non-aligned movement policy where they didn't ally with anyone, but in reality, they allied very closely with the Russians, because if you look at the military equipment, 80% of it is coming from Russia. But now in the past 10-15 years, the whole 15-20 years, the whole Indian tilt towards the US, the opening of its economy, the more investments, the closeness between the BJP government and the Trump and all of that, pushed India on the other side. But the problem is that institutionally, the Indian government is still very much linked to the US, to the former USSR and now Russia. Much of the defense equipment, its upgradation relies on the Russians. So for the India to choose a camp is disastrous. And the India probably doesn't realize, and Pakistan does realize, because we were told either with us or against us. But now India is coming to recognition that the American friendship is not going to be very easy, because if you look at the last 2 weeks of entire discourse coming from the US, they're shaming India, they're telling India that it's not ready to be a superpower, they're telling India that it does not have a moral compass, and it is bulldozing India to take a particular side. And that is very dangerous for India, because India cannot be isolated in this region. India cannot be isolated with Russia, Pakistan, China, and other countries in the region. And given that the fact that with the whole SCO and the opening of the regional markets, this whole regional connectivity, India cannot sustain itself as a lone partner of the United States in the region, and it puts itself in a very, very miserable position.
And you think, जो आप SCO की बात करें, you think the West is able to recognize this? You think in the world power global politics, is this something that's happening on a very beginner level, do you think?
No.
Or is it something which is seen as
it's already there, it's very much there, it was there very much 5 years back. The SCO countries represent more than half of the world. You have Russia, you have China, you have Pakistan, you have India, you have Bangladesh and a few other countries. That's nearly 50% of the world population just in 5 of these countries. Moreover, these are top 2 out of 3 top economies are Russia and China and India. So it's not a very, very, I mean, you can't underestimate the power, you cannot underestimate the geopolitical significance of this group that has emerged, both in terms of security and economics.
And then is conflict, maybe these ties will be taken seriously, you think?
In this conflict, I think in a subtle way, SCO has played its card. SCO is playing under the table, and I think that is what the Western world has continued to now recognize as well, that there is not West against East, it is West against the SCO, I mean NATO against SCO. Yes,
right. Perhaps my final question, and then we can see agar aur koi hota, is about if you think this conflict taught lessons about to this region, or specifically to China, about Taiwan. So did it tell anything about it can retake Taiwan by force? Do you think that kind of, because as we're talking about SCO, but then there's also China-India conflict, there's also Pakistan-India conflict, how does all of that kind of, come together now?
That's a very good question to end with. I think any warfare leaves very insightful messages for all of us. I think this war especially is most important because it has changed the game. I mean, for somebody who's been working in the political science and national security for the last 10 years, I personally feel it's been a 180-degree tilt on what we thought, on what we believed does not exist. The international order, the fairness of the international order, we already knew. But in this open and candid way, it came out as unfair. The Western hypocrisy, the media hypocrisy, continue to talk about the Western freedom of speech and Western human rights agenda and all of that. I mean, it came crashing down because now the Muslim world and the entire world now sees the duplicity of Kashmir and what's happening in Ukraine. So there is a duplicity angle over there. What does that tell us? It tells us one very important thing, that the world will continue to be uncertain. And in this uncertainty, we need to be self-sustainable. That basically makes these countries and our parts of the world become more inward-looking, more interested in self-reliance, not to be reliant on other partners and this and that, and also recognizing the fact that technology, as good as it is, but if the technology is not organic and locally developed, then you have a problem what Russia is facing right now. That you can be put into central banking issues, the technology can, the way how Facebook, the Twitter and all of that are actively waging war against Russia for right or for wrong. But countries like Pakistan, that are smaller countries, you realize how fragile you are. All it takes is a switch of a button and you will be completely redundant in the international order without any ability to defend yourself. So I do think that this inward-looking approach and regional approach is becoming more and more promising for a country like Pakistan, for India, China, that we need to focus on the local economies. Two, we need to also focus a lot on the regional trade, so that because there is more interest of the regional countries to stay at peace because it's costly. But if a country like the United States, a war in Europe or a war in South Asia doesn't really affect us. So it can switch on and switch off at its will. So I do think that there are very strong messages for our parts of the world. For China, again, it's a very clear playbook on what happens if it takes over Taiwan, which may or may not do. But it does also recognize its limitations, that this can lead to an escalation leading to a World War III. And even right now, as we speak, I don't personally think there is any sort of chance for a World War III. But this entire fiasco has given us one very clear understanding, that we thought that in 2022, with our level of education and consciousness and human and machines landing on Mars and wormholes and all of that, that maybe World War III is a redundant idea. It's very much there, and we do think that any mistake, like recently the Indian missile landing in Pakistan, even a mistake like that could lead to a full-scale nuclear implosion. But I'm very glad that both countries were able to manage that very accurately.
Right. Two questions that I ask all my guests before we conclude. Very briefly, your comments on both of them. How do you think COVID-19 impacted the world the most in any one way personally that you think comes to your mind? And second, how do you see Pakistan in 2050?
6 months back, if you had asked me the questions about how COVID-19 impacted the world, I would have said that it made the countries come together. It made the countries become more understanding to our existential crisis and ability to work together in a sort of pandemic. Right now, I do believe that the COVID had provided us an opportunity to go beyond the nation state and selfish zero-sum game. Unfortunately, the recent crises have shown that that's not the case. So COVID-19 impacted us economically in terms of lives, but I now feel that it was just like any other virus happened 100 years ago, that the world continued to come back to its, again, very greed-driven, self-interest whole political hierarchy. So that's that. I think in a few months' time, in a year's time, we'll probably forget anything related to COVID, and it would probably mean nothing in the long run in terms of the social and behavioral change I'm talking about. So that's that. So it's an opportunity lost, in my opinion. The world could have come together and done much better, but I don't think that's happened. The second question was related to
Pakistan 2050 का आप कैसे देखते हैं?
2050, okay. We've done data on 2030, not 2050. It's very hard to do data without that much uncertainty. I do personally think, and partly because I'm naively optimistic when it comes to policy making and generally in life, Pakistan may appear to be at the worst of its crisis at right now, the economy, the political and issues and all of that. But what people miss underneath this all are certain very important variables that are present. Those variables, I can just list them down.
Yes.
One, you have 140 million kids under the age of 30. Now, we continue to talk about these kids as a ticking time bomb, the youth bulge and all. The reality is that either way, this youth that is there will find its way towards growth. Either you hand them the power, you hand them the opportunities, you hand them the trainings, the groomings to be a productive member of the society, or they will take it. It's going to be either way. So I'm very convinced that this one variable, 140 million youth, there is no potential taking time off. It is only one thing, and that is an asset for you. How we are going to use that, that's going to be really, so we can use them to be the game changer in the metaverse. We can use them to be a game changer in the science and technology, or we can just use them for menial jobs. But either way, it is a big asset for us. The second data point is that in the rise and fall of nations, the sign graph, where do we stand right now? We stand below the bottom at the moment. We've suffered the most. I mean, I love studying the empires, so I study the metadata of how nations rise, how nations fall. And if you look at the traits of all the nations that rise, they don't rise out of prosperity. They rise out of the worst crisis, out of the most worst depressions, and out of what we call the tragedy. This nation checks all the boxes. We've seen the tragedy, we've seen the economic collapse, we've seen everything. The only way forward is up. So I do think, and I'm not saying that as a hope, I'm saying that with a very quantified data, that is the only thing that happens. The last thing on this is also this fact that the third, which is very important, is the change in technology. We live in a world in 2022 where digital technologies and data are radically changing the environment, which basically means one thing, that the status quo will be made irrelevant the sooner and the more technology will continue to be there. I mean, how many of you watch TV at home? It's all over the phone. How many of you uses PCs? How many of you use laptops? It's all on the phone. The way technology is making irrelevant certain status quo powers and all of that, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, by 2030, I do think Pakistan will be one of the most important growth region in the world. It's impossible it won't be. And I mean, I also believe that borders changes and the world changes by 2050. It doesn't matter Pakistan is in this shape or any other shape by 2050 or 2100. The people will be here. The people have been here for the past 3,000 years. The people will be here. And these people, I think they have together suffered a lot and they're together in this shared tragedy. And I do believe that tragedy creates the best stories and the best stories create the best empires as well.
Thank you for ending on a relatively hopeful note. Our conversation was quite morbid in terms of understanding global politics. But really, thank you so much for your very, very insightful conversation and for your time today.
My pleasure to be here.
I'm Mariam Kiani and you're watching the Pakistan Pivot, and I'll see you next Thursday.